Continuing on with utilizing historical written descriptions of technical applications, we look at another one from John Martin Littlejohn, where he's speaking primarily about methodologies with respect to the ribs or the thoracic region. Essentially what we have is he tells you to create a fixed point with one hand against a thoracic vertebrae, right? So he says first dorsal or first thoracic vertebrae. Essentially you're creating a fixed point there, you're holding that, you're using the arm to create the motion, and by holding the vertebrae, so if we consider the concept that I utilize to describe many things in relational motion, one thing stays still, one thing moves in relation to it. What you're doing is you're holding the vertebrae still, and you're utilizing the arm to create pull on the ribs through multiple connections to move the rib in relation to the relatively still thoracic vertebrae, right? So I would not necessarily suggest that a seated position is best for actually doing this in the conceptual way that it is described. However, the method basically looks like you hold on to the vertebrae, so you put your hand behind, you hold on to the arm, you lift it up, and you bring it around, right? So what you'll see is if I'm not careful in how I do this, because I move a lot, the arm moves a lot, so it's hard for me to keep track of what's actually going on with the vertebrae or the body, right? I can palpate what's going on with the vertebrae, I can use my eyes, but I have to do a lot of moving around. So what I can maybe not notice is as I start to pull, I can push my patient forward. So I feel like I'm putting pressure on that vertebrae to really hold on to it, right? But I can wiggle my patient around unless I'm careful, unless I'm utilizing my eyes broadly to have multiple points of reference to figure out whether or not I'm moving the patient or whether or not I'm holding the patient relatively still and moving the vertebrae or moving the rib relative to the still vertebrae. But the motion, this is very reminiscent of a motion that Still would talk about. Still talked about it essentially with the patient in standing against the door frame. He talked about it in more or less standing position where you're trying to reach around the patient, right? So he talked about it in standing and seated, right? But here, essentially what we're looking at is relatively still vertebrae, moving arm to pull on muscles to move rib in relation to relatively still vertebrae. The challenge with this is that in a seated position, you have to keep the patient still, so less stable means I need to keep the patient more stable, but this position, because I'm using the arm, makes that somewhat difficult unless I'm really, really careful with my eyes. And also I would suggest that although the method is as described, it may not do what you hope it to do because there's so much opportunity for the patient to move, but the Littlejohn method or the method that we've noted, so the slide that you saw before that says pause to read, basically you have them sitting, grab their arm, keep the vertebrae still, right? Move it like that, and you've kept the vertebrae still, you moved the rib in relation to it based on muscular pull off the arm.